Welcome to another episode of the Fear of Missing Out podcast, a show where we talk to superfans about popular and niche things and ask them what they like about them and where you, the newcomer, can get started. On this week's episode, we're peeling back the veil of misconception on the sexually charged lifestyle known as bimbo culture. All right, lovely guest, would you care to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Alexa, and I'm the host of a podcast called Bimbo Night School. I'm a student at Columbia as well. I'm studying music business there, so I'm in my third year, so I've got one more year to go. But predominantly, I work for Fort Knox Studios and private stock studios as well.
All right, you keep yourself very busy. So I know that one thing I wanted to talk to you about when I brought you onto the show is almost at the same time we both had the bright idea to start our own podcasts. My whole thing is just to introduce people to new things, and yours is actually to do that same thing, but you go on a different route of things. So one thing that you do is you let people know more about bimbo culture. So I know that for me, I'm gonna need you to get me more up to speed on what that is and what that means and what that entails. Aside from like the handful of TikToks and articles written by like people like Chrissy Klepeka and the Chronicle's own Justice Lewis, who wrote about bimbo culture and her opinions piece, I'm hella ignorant when it comes to those kinds of things. So would you mind running me through, explaining it to me like I'm 5, what bimbo culture is?
Yeah, absolutely. So in like a condensed version, bimbo culture a lot has to do with like taking back terms that were used against like hyper feminine women for so long. I think for so long, like people were boiled down to like derogatory terms like obviously bimbo and like hoe and slut, like were words that were weaponized against women for a really long time for either being like hyper feminine or for like just kind of owning their sexuality and things like that. So just kind of like taking back that word and taking back those terms and kind of like embracing them to mean that it's okay to embrace your sexuality, it's okay to embrace hyperfemininity and things like that. So just kind of like really taking that back and kind of owning that as a whole.
Okay. So I know, well, this being my first, I guess, proper introduction to what bimbo culture is, I wanted to ask you, what was your sort of introduction to just the world of bimbo culture, and do you consider yourself one, and what are kind of the qualifications, or like if there are even any, for being a bimbo?
Yeah, absolutely. So I obviously, like with the birth of TikTok, everything has been a lot, like people have found communities that they often didn't even know that they were a part of already. And I think that that's like a super important thing that social media is doing for all of us, is connecting us like all to communities that we didn't even know that we belong to, that can often make us like feel a lot more empowered or at home. And I think that not knowing that I like belonged to this like subculture of people that were hyper feminine people that oftentimes like owned their sexuality and were very blunt about it and very open about it and like very willing to communicate about those types of things on a very like casual level. Not knowing that that was like okay and that there were other people that did that as well and that like felt those same ways was super empowering. I think a bimbo in general is just, like I said, somebody that, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be like a hyper feminine person either, because I know Chrissy has done a fantastic job of like opening up that whole community and like that whole structure to people that are, non-binary folks, even, and men too. Like the whole himbo term is like a very funny thing. Himbo and thembos, like she uses that a lot. And it's like just a big community of people that, may not always feel like they have it all together and may feel like some of the things that they're talking about often get frowned upon, or that they aren't taken seriously because like they are they're comfortable with their sexuality, they're comfortable with a lot of times on the podcast I talk about like just messing up, like, or just doing things that aren't always like seen as super glamorous. So things like going too far and, you know, going like to parties when you're younger and like really not knowing where to draw the line and things like that, and like just embracing that those things are okay and that you learn from those things. And I think anybody can be a bimbo if you try, as long as you're an accepting person.
Mm-hmm. And not to add a tangential Simpsons reference, but sometimes I know that people, whenever there's something that's like really sex positive, they oftentimes will sort of be like Skinner in like the Simpsons moment where like there's a bunch of like girls dancing on him and he's like, oh God, oh no, type of thing. So you mentioned that sometimes people do misstep and they are in situations where they're kind of like more in muddy waters with that. Can you explain more on what that situation kind of is?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I guess more so than anything, I think our generation is doing a great job of bringing to light the fact that there are a lot of things that happen in your 20s that aren't super glamorous and aren't super like, I would love to go through that again, or just like situations like that. When it comes to growing into your sexuality and when it comes to really like owning that aspect of your life. And I think that a lot of times people try to mask that or hide it, or, you know, put on a persona about who they like, put up a front about who they are and like what parts of their sexuality they embrace and which parts they choose to hide away. And I think it's super important that like we as individuals come to like a conclusion that this is something that we biologically as humans are composed to act upon. Like we are biologically wired to be attracted to other people, and like that falls into a lot of different things, and that's fallen into religion and how religion has continuously shamed like people's sexuality and things like that, and how like different establishments have, you know, put down women and femininity as a whole, and how that's really like impacted, you know, vulnerable groups like sex workers, for instance. I talk about that a lot on the podcast as well, that like that is a very vulnerable group of people that is often kind of, you know, like thrown under the bus for different things that, and oftentimes like put into very uncomfortable and unsafe situations because of what they do for work. And it's interesting to me, and I mentioned this on the show too, is that we as a whole, I would say, I don't want to like misquote some random statistic, but I would say a large percentage of the population does take part in like pornography, or they go attend like strip clubs, or they, you know, whatever, they like may solicit people for like other sexual acts, and like to then shame someone on a human level when you are part of the reason that the industry exists is extremely hypocritical. So it's like it's a dangerous field to be in, and I see that there's like some sort of like societal turn a little bit with it, like things are starting to come around a little bit and be more open and accepting to sex work, but there's a lot of work to be done.
And I know that there was, at least when there was some social movements like Free the Nipple, where there were the dude bros that like completely took the message of that and like turned it on and says like, yeah, I'm all about this, well, missing the entire point of the message. So I was going to ask you, since we mentioned Chrissy, but are there any other like certain like figureheads when it comes to bimbo culture, or just people that you kind of look up to in general, and what are the kind of works that they do to sort of help push that message forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And on that, in that same vein, like it's important to also note that not every bimbo needs to be extremely politically charged either. I know Chrissy has used her platform for good in that way, but if that's not necessarily something that you're, you know, like super passionate about or super knowledgeable about, obviously you should educate yourself because it's going on around you. But at the same time, like if you're not using your platform for, you know, for politics or for like a specific you know, political vendetta, that's, you know, also fine. And on that note, there are a few accounts that I do follow that aren't necessarily as political as Chrissy is, but there's one that's very like empowering. Her name's Glitter Paris, and she's I want to say she's like in her 50s, but she's like very energetic and very like it's very much like talking to you type of content, and she kind of goes on these little tangents about how you should own who you are, and if you want to dress XYZ way and you want to act this way and you want to do this, then you should, and you should be happy that you are. So those types of things are like super empowering to like watch too, because there are hyper feminine women all over different platforms that are like saying, hey, it's okay if you want to dress in nearly nothing. That's totally fine. And, like, you can be accepted for doing that. So she's a great example. I'm trying to think of some other ones, but I'm drawing a blank. So she's a great example of one that isn't as, like, political if that's not your thing with Chrissy.
And you mentioned empowerment, so I wanted to turn the question a little bit more back towards you. So in what ways has sort of bimbo culture sort of empowered you in like just how you conduct yourself in like your daily life? In what ways have you like sort of drawn lessons or like any sort of like just ways of like, I don't know, how your lifestyle has maybe changed or been impacted by that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the podcast as an example for one, I've been having a lot of like interpersonal conversations, just kind of like with myself, just like thinking about like what it really means to put all of what I talk about in the podcast on the internet, and like having that be up for people's judgment. And it's been an awakening for me, because I think like the more I talk about it and the more I like kind of explore different topics and everything, the more I realize that you can live a life of professionalism. I like am proud of myself at the moment for doing like the different things that I'm doing, like aside from the podcast. So like in addition to the show, I am doing a bunch of other stuff that like is developing like my professional career, while I'm talking about some crazy like raunchy topics on this podcast that I just sometimes do. So like creating that balance and like finding that balance has been an interesting journey, but and it hasn't come without some interesting conversations with people about it. But I think that has like impacted me a lot, and just like seeing how much it gets people talking and like almost uncomfortable. So that's something super impactful, I think, over time that has really changed my life. And I know that you mentioned, and I guess when it comes to all things, once you like kind of have your hat in like a lot of different games, once you sort of have like your toes dipped into like a conversation that's like more sexually like charged, people tend to more clue in on that than like paying attention like, oh, well, you also do these other things as well. So I wanted to ask you, are there any other like types of like discourse or anything like that becomes mind numbing when it comes to like those types of like sort of misconstrued kind of like hyper focusing on that like more sexually charged side of you, or and what kind of like discourse and misconceptions sort of come with being a part of bimbo culture? Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Recently I've had a lot of conversations with when I first started doing the podcast, I guess I'll start there. I knew that it ran a risk of ending up in the hands of like my parents, or like people that I was a little terrified to like be that open and honest with, and employers, things like that. Those were all things that came to mind when I initially started. But I think about like podcasts like Call Her Daddy is a great example. I don't necessarily follow that same structure, but like the concept of talking about that type of subject matter where it's like very sexually charged, it's a little scary for an individual, and it shouldn't be, because we all go through it. We've all had these experiences. Oftentimes I'll ask people to write in stories about XYZ, and they'll give me like a detailed thing, but they want it to be anonymous, because they don't feel that it's like a good thing to have out there. And by me like kind of being a martyr in this whole thing, and be just kind of like creating the show to be like, hey, I did this and I'm fine, like I'm okay. And I think that's like a super important message too to get across. And it's even seeped into, weirdly enough, like my dating life. Like I've had some odd conversations with people about it, like, oh, I just don't feel comfortable with like you putting that type of information out there. And it was all things like that have happened in my past, and like they exist there. So I don't know why like it's anything that we ever need to hide, especially when it comes to like sexuality and like being open about the things that happen as like a 20-something that you never talk about with like other people, because it can be uncomfortable. It can be weird times, like weird things that you go through that may be like hard to face, but we all have them. So having the conversation be muted is difficult, and it shouldn't be that way.
And so for those who are interested in knowing more or educate themselves more on bimbo culture, like myself here today on this podcast, or people who might wish to become one, where can they go to sort of like read up and sort of embrace that life?
Yeah, I think like I said, I think TikTok has been a great way to kind of find communities that you belong to, and find people that you relate to, and find things that you like doing that you may not have even known. So I think that's a great place to start. Even if you just like search the word bimbo, a billion different people pop up sharing this, that, or the other thing. And while some of it may be more like entertainment based and less like, educational, I think that some of the people that have, based this conversation around themselves have gone on to do different press. And like, for example, I keep using her, but she's like one of the most well-known at the moment. Chrissy, she's from Chicago. She lives here, so she's like a very centric part of like that conversation. But she did an article with Rolling Stone, and that article really embodies like a lot of what I see bimbo culture to be, and like what I love it being. But then there are also other sides of the conversation. So there's a lot of different like avenues for bimbo culture in general, because there are self-proclaimed bimbos that have been in the porn industry for a really long time, and don't like that there's politics now being tacked on to that image, and that there's like different conversations being applied to that image. And I can see where that would be applicable, but I think like myself, I'm a political bimbo. So I really do believe that like that if we're going to talk about if we're going to have this image like all wrapped pretty in pink, like you might as well tack an important message on top of that platform.
All right. I'd say that has been a podcast. This will be the part where I open it up to you. Obviously, you've mentioned before the work on your podcast, but feel free to share any of the projects or any social media with the people so that they can keep the conversation going with you online on the interwebs.
Yeah, absolutely. So the podcast, the Instagram, with all of the links there attached, is at Bimbo Night School Pod on Instagram. I also do have a Reddit page by the same name, where you can kind of like ask me questions and things like that. But aside from the podcast, follow Private Stock Studios, and I do like their internship coordination. So if you're looking for an internship, let me know. And I also do their project management stuff for some of their different artists. And you can follow me if you want. I'm all right sometimes. It's at Lexaloo143 on Instagram. And I think that is me. That's me.
All right. Well, now you guys know more than zero about bimbo culture. We'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.